You're what?
I'm gonna mute you for a sec. All right, what's up, buddy? Wait, can you hear me? Hello?
Wait, hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Hey, how's it going?
Alrighty. You know, you don't have to do all of that that reading and checking sources or anything if you just blindly agree with everything I say. So
Yeah,
just something to consider there.
I don't think I'm gonna blindly agree with everything you say, but all right.
So, all right. Well, I have one thing I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
Heritability.
Sure
Like,
thing.
yeah. And this is sort of important to understand, like, basically anything. Like, it may sound like pedantic or minutiae, but it's actually fundamental to, like,
No, I definitely agree.
Literally everything.
Yeah, heritability is really important.
Yeah. So just imagine in your mind a cow.
Yeah.
Like,
or
just think of
you can just talk to me about it. I'm curious to hear what you think about it. I think I have a decent understanding of heritability.
Okay. Well, maybe. Well, just think about like a cow. Like,
Okay.
and you see a cow in a field.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage of that cow is environmental? What percentage of it is genetic?
I don't know. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, it depends.
Well,
We could talk about a specific trait.
It's not so much that it depends as in that's like a meaningless question.
Yeah, sure. You could talk about
Because,
individual traits. I mean, yeah.
Well, it's a meaningless. Well, okay, it's a meaningless question because all organisms are just genes expressed in an environment. It's
Sure.
kind of like asking, you know, let's say you bake a cake. What function of that cake is or how much of that cake is a function of the heat in the oven or the ingredients, right? Like, it's kind of a meaningless question.
Okay.
Okay. So when you talk about an organism, is it a function of its genes, or is it's a baked cake, right? It's not, you know. So when we talk about heritability, you're talking about it in the only sense that it can even make any sense, and that is comparing things. Like, you can't say how much of a cow is genetic. That's like a meaningless question. But what you can do is say, okay, now we have two cows. Okay, and this cow weighs more. This cow has bigger horns. This cow produces more milk, or whatever thing you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can try to infer somehow, maybe get a little bit creative how you do this study, but try to infer somehow that difference. Okay, and how much of that difference is a function of environmental difference? You know, you're petting the cow, you're brushing it more, you know, you sing to it or whatever, or how much of it is a function of genetic difference. And so when talking about heritability, it only makes sense in terms of differences between whatever it is you're comparing. And I think one of the guys you had on, I just caught a little clip of it. You were saying that heritability is not relevant to race differences, when in fact it's just the opposite. It is only relevant in terms of differences. It only has any meaning in terms of difference, not in terms of it.
The problem is that heritability will never describe or doesn't really describe differences in groups. Is the problem with using heritability here, I feel.
Within
like
groups,
if you were between groups. So if you had two groups and there was a massive difference in something between the two of them, heritability doesn't necessarily describe that. Is my issue with using heritability?
It only describes that. Like,
what do you mean? Heritability can describe variance within groups. What do you mean?
It can describe variance in whatever you're comparing. You can talk about general heritability, where you basically draw a circle around a population, and there's math where you quantify the variation, and then you can quantify the proportion of that variation that's attributable to genetic variation.
Sure.
That's one way to do it. But you can also say, here's two groups. This group is taller than that group. This group weighs more than that group, and try to infer somehow, you know, what proportion of that is due to an environmental difference between the groups or a genetic difference between the groups.
Okay, but we can have a trait with a 0.95 heritability.
Sure.
There could be massive differences between two groups, even though that trait is incredibly heritable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you pointing to heritability and saying that this will give us the massive defining explanation between the two differences of groups to explain a difference, I don't feel like that's a fair statement.
I don't really follow.
So,
Like,
let's say we have a trait like height, okay? Let's say that height
okay,
is heritable. Let's say it's a 1.0 heritability even, right? We can say that height is fully
total
heritable, right?
total
So
hair. Okay.
we can take a population of people that are 4 feet and another population of 6 feet, right? You can't, even though that trait is fully heritable, you can't necessarily say,
Yeah,
right?
okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
I know what you're saying. Yeah, the plants and soil thing.
sure, yeah.
Yeah, that's true, but like let me put it this way. The argument you're making is you can't extrapolate general heritability onto between group heritability, but that's not necessarily what I'm doing.
Sure, and I'm not necessarily making that argument. I'm just saying that that heritability doesn't necessarily describe it. Now, it could describe it, but there are a lot of steps you have
Yeah.
to take to get
Well,
there. Like,
sure. Well, basically, well,
shit, it just disconnected, or I think it did. Can you hear me? This guy is the guy that owns the alternative hypothesis website.
hello,
Hello?
internet.
Sorry. Okay, right after my comment, you got cut off.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, what you're saying, like, okay, it's just I think this is just semantics. Like within group heritability is not the same thing as between group heritability,
Sure.
and so
So-
and so you can't just make a leap. However, I would say that the general heritability, if we know, for example, that the general heritability of IQ in the U.S. for adults, people aged 24 and older, is 80%, but your starting assumption for the between group heritability should be somewhere around there.
That sounds very fallacious to me. I don't
It sounds
feel,
very fallacious.
yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
That just sounds very, very fallacious to me. The way that just because something is very heritable doesn't mean that the environment can have a dramatic impact on it. Like,
Oh, sure.
the expression of
Yeah.
genes in an environment is central to how things present. So I don't know if, I mean, I guess maybe you could start off
Yeah.
with that
I
kind
mean,
of
you
assumption,
could
but
say
if you
the same
did,
thing
like, you would
about
start
height.
off with that assumption as a hypothesis, right? You would have to further go on to prove.
Oh yeah,
that.
absolutely. And there's multiple lines of there's multiple lines of evidence for that. But I think the most compelling is probably subtest heritability. But it's a little bit complicated. But once you understand subtest heritability stuff, it's actually, I mean, that's actually just sort of my personal history. It was the subtest heritability stuff that made me think that basically made me into quote unquote a race realist. It was that argument that really sold it to me. So, and that is like, because on all these IQ tests, there's all sorts of subtests. There's block design, picture assembly, digit span, forward, backward, coding. There's all these subtests.
Okay.
Some of the tests have a higher general heritability than others. General heritability established in twin studies. So, and what is found is that there are bigger racial gaps on the more heritable subtests. And that's important because if, for example, let's take the old dead horse, the black-white IQ gap. If that were 50% heritable, 50% environmental, that is 50% of the difference were due to genetic differences, we would expect a correlation between subtest heritability and magnitude of the racial gap of 0. If it was all environmental, we would expect a correlation between subtest heritability and the magnitude of the gap of -1. But if it was all genetic, we would expect a correlation of 1, right? And there have been 4 studies that I know of, and I am finally putting that to paper in something I'm writing here. It's about 0.7. Is the correlation, which implies a heritability of about 0.8 between the racial groups. So, and that is roughly the same as the general heritability within the United States. Okay, so
even if this was true, if you understand how the heritability works and you understand the reasons why some of these different types of intelligences appear the way they do, couldn't you use this information to attempt to bridge it with different types of instruction or education?
You could. You could say, hey, I'll say a few things. First off, like heritability does not necessarily mean, it can't be changed. Like like for example, the variation in height could be 100% down to genetics today, but somebody could invent a pill that made everyone grow 10 feet taller, right?
Sure.
I mean, so heritability is not necessarily the same
Or
as
say you somehow,
malleability.
for something even more relevant, say that you proved somehow, I don't think this is true, but say that you found like a 100% link to dyslexia and a single nucleotide or whatever, and a SNP or whatever, right? Say that
and you
found
could just knock it out.
Yeah, or even not knock it out, but you found it, right? People with dyslexia can be taught to read at extremely proficient levels, more so than the average reader, right? That's possible. You just have to teach them in a different way. So that's something where every test could show that, hey, these people with this SNP can't read. They can't read well. They can't read well, right? But after you discover it, you correct it, you educate them in a particular way, and then all of a sudden they're up to whatever normal standard would be.
Yeah, but I will say one thing though is that that as it happens, like you can raise people's like their nominal IQ score quite a bit. And of course, that has happened in the past. There's something that Charles Murray called the Flynn Effect, although I don't like the term the Flynn Effect because it actually first quantified by a guy named Tuddenham in Germany but whatever. The rise in IQ scores. But one thing to note about that is that, and this is something that Arthur Jensen talked about, is that the secular rise in IQ scores has been hollow for G, meaning that like, now, G is not necessarily the same as
IQ.
Well, G is not doesn't necessarily mean heritability. Like, there's not a 1-to-1 correlation between the G loading of a subtest and its heritability, but it's kind of close. Like, it's a good proxy for it. So, and so one thing to note is that like, people say, well, IQ is malleable, and IQs have gone up, 6 or 7 points or whatever over a certain time span. And, and I feel sort of weird saying this because like I'm constantly talking about the importance of IQ. But then here I kind of say, don't take IQ so seriously. Right, because it's a whole bunch of subtests, and different tests have different subtests and different weightings. So, and quite frankly, like people talk about the 15-point black-white IQ gap. That it's 15 points. Well, sure, but that's just a function of the kind of tests that popular IQ tests happen to use. That's just a function of, what is Stanford Binet using? What is Wace using? They can make a much bigger racial gap or a much smaller racial gap by adding or removing subtests.
Sure.
So I forgot what I was talking about. I'm kind of tired. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
I kind of babble off in
so,
directions.
So I guess let me ask you a couple general things, because I discovered this with Charles Murray, which was incredibly disappointing, is that it seems like the people that cite this type of research are oftentimes taking it to much more extreme places than the people that originally did it. I don't know if that's true about you or not, because obviously I haven't dug too much into your website. But so do you believe that the majority difference, so I'm not saying a couple IQ points, but that the majority difference in IQ, right, or however we approximate G, that difference between groups is down to genetics, that the majority will be explained that way?
Yeah, about 80%.
Gotcha.
So, and that specific number is basically a function of, is basically subtest heritability. Genome-wide association studies. Well, genome-wide association studies right now are at about 50%. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go early on, they were only it's a bit difficult because like with there's a problem known as missing heritability. This is the gap between sort of traditional heritability estimates and molecular genetics. Like, for example, there was a time when the molecular geneticists were only able to find 10% of, quote unquote, find 10% of the variance in height in the genes, right? Whereas twin studies all typically said that the heritability of height was about 0.9 in the US or something like that. Sure. So there was this gap between what the twin researchers were doing and what the molecular geneticists were doing. So that has to do with that has to do with the fact that it's hard to to find the genes. It's really difficult to find the genes.
Sure.
And even in genome-wide association studies, they're not even really finding the genes. They're finding. It's almost like they're finding rubrics of genes. They're basically saying like these combinations in this way produces this effect, and they're not even necessarily finding like individuated.
Yeah, sure. I understand what you're saying. It's not like a single gene is going to be like, this is how much intelligence you have. It's going to be over a wide collection of genes that will contribute maybe a little bit here and there.
But another problem to consider with genome-wide association studies is that they only look at additive effects, what we call additive genetic effects, as opposed to epistatic effects. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of where, like, I took a few genetics classes in college, but I'm really out of my depth when I try to explain this. So like basically additive genetic effects is as it sounds. It's functionally, you have this gene, it does this, and you sort of add them up, in combination with some others. And then there's epistatic effects, which are genetic effects that are not quote unquote in the model. And so the GWASs have difficulty with epistatic effects, as far as I know. In fact, I probably shouldn't even talk about this because I don't know enough about this to talk about this, and I'm probably saying a bunch of crap, so I should just shut up.
Gotcha. Well, okay. I guess, is there anything else you really wanted to talk about? Or why do you think that, I guess, mainstream science doesn't discuss this? Because they're too worried about being unpopular?
Okay, well, that's actually a bit of speculation, but kind of an interesting thing. Mainstream science, will talk about this sort of in the margins. Like, for example, it's really interesting. I'm going off of my memory here, but I read some stuff by Chomsky, and he would mention in passing, when he's talking about South Africa, that some degree of race differences is probably true, but he says that in the margins. He doesn't make a deal out of it. I mean, and of course Chomsky would never want to make a deal out of it given his political vision and stuff. But and Sam Harris, for example, he used to sort of refer to race differences in the margin, but of course recently not so marginal. There was a guy, Stefan Molyneux. Do you know Stefan Molyneux?
Yeah.
Yeah. He. It was interesting, because many moons ago I used to be an anarchist. Silly me, and so I would listen to Molyneux, and he would say, like in a few podcasts, he was arguing against racial identity, but then in the margins he said, yes, there are biological race differences and stuff. But he would say that's stupid, and he would use that and relate that sort of to the family, and say that that blood ties to your family are stupid, when your family are a bunch of people you don't like. So and he tried to say that's kind of like racial ties. You shouldn't have any ties to people you don't like just because they're white or whatever. Even though there are some genetic differences in intelligence, but who cares? We're all individuals. So and of course now Molyneux is not so marginal about that stuff. Now Stefan Molyneux is probably the most effective white nationalist propagandist there is at this point, which is sort of funny.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, obviously they don't. People don't want to say this stuff out in public because people are individuals, and I don't think there's some conspiracy. It's just they don't want to say it because they don't want to get in fights, and they don't want conflict with a lot of brown people they know in their life. Probably has a lot to do with it. They know a lot of brown people that they're friends with, and they don't want to they don't want to get in conflict there either. So,
gotcha.
I think that's what it is.
So, is this just research that you kind of present, or do you advocate any particular type of policy behind it, or?
Yeah, I advocate full-on white separatism. I recognize, but it's important for me. It's important for me that anybody who's I want to live in you know, I want to live in I want to continue this multiracial experiment. I want to continue this multiracial program, and see if it works out. You know, if people want to do that, it's important. It's very important that they all be allowed to do that. Because what you don't want is something where it's like, you know, some regime takes over everything and impose their way as the only way, and then people speculate about what the alternatives would be. You know, I think the alternatives need to be clear, and so that's an important.
So your kind of mindset is that the
it's important. It's important that it needs to be voluntary. People need to go into it supporting it.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that you think the multicultural experiment will probably fail, and then that's when they'll turn to the.
Yeah, well, it'll fail. Well, it depends on what you mean by fail. I mean, is Brazil, is that a fail? Is Brazil a failure? Not maybe. No. Yes. I don't. Yeah. I mean, Brazil is not as good as you know, Western Europe or even Poland, but it's not hell on earth. I'll tell you that. And there's nice places. It's nice places in Brazil. So I mean, let's not pretend that a multiracial. Now, it may be different if you bring in, you know, Muslims. It may be different if you bring in, or it may be different if your country is, you know, 60%. It's sad to say, it's 60% African, for example. That may not produce the same result as sort of this Amerindian, Portuguese, Spaniard hybrid population. So, but yeah, I guess I would say. I guess I would say to like a lot of the people think about this is sort of like the impossibility of there not being any race differences. And even if you want to say, well, you know, race is not a real coherent construct. Races don't really exist. There is clines or whatever. And I would argue against that, but let's just bypass that for now and say, sure, whatever. They're not, you know, humans' genetic differences don't rise to the level of race, whatever. Even if you want to say that that's true, let's just grant that for the sake of argument.
Sure. If it makes you feel better, we could talk about ancestry in place of race, since I know that's a little bit more hardcore or more grounded in reality, but
whatever. But the thing is, you have these groups, you know, and like people say, well, I don't think white people and black people. What does that mean? Like the thing is, like the groups, they're already defined. They are defined for you. So when we're talking about genetic differences between these groups, we're talking about groups that already exist, right? They don't need to be scientifically defined in any way, right? They're already there. And so you just draw a line around them, all right? And there's going to be inequalities between these groups. There's going to be all these gaps. Gotcha. If there's genetic differences between these groups. Even if you want to say that the total aggregate genetic data doesn't rise to the level of being a race. I mean, it could be, in theory, it could be like 5 gene loci. It could just be 5 locations on the genome that cause massive differences in everything, you know, and and so in that sense, whether or not they rise to the level of biological subspecies or haplogroup or whatever category you want to use, is irrelevant in a practical sense if there are genetic differences between these groups that have themselves defined themselves as independent from each other. So, and I think, and it's sort of something that's happened recently. I don't know what you think about. I guess we'll call deep white privilege stuff, like Tim Wise stuff. Like I would say that there's like 3 groups of racial thinking in the United States, and that is like, you know, the civil rights movement, sort of the multiracial optimists that like both political parties believe in. I mean, they have differences in opinion in terms of how to get there and stuff, but both Republicans and Democrats believe in racial equality and all that stuff, right? But there's been a problem in that, you know, it's been 52 years and there hasn't been much narrowing of economic gaps or of any of these standardized test score gaps or health gaps or prison population. All these gaps are still basically there. And in fact, in prison may have even gone up from segregation days, but that's another topic. So what I think has happened, this is sort of my pet little theory here, what I think has happened is that there's been a bunch of academics who have seen like a lot of the traditional explanations for racial equality fail since over these years. And as a result, and that sort of puts them at a fork in the road. And that fork in the road is either race realism or, the racial oppression is even deeper than we ever thought. So they're basically split between race realism and white privilege. Kind of splits off like that. That's what I think happens. But
gotcha. I feel like 2 generations is a pretty short time to fix what could be like incredibly structural problems. I don't know if that's necessarily fair to say. It's already been 50 years and it hasn't been fixed. I'm not sure if that's a fair statement.
Right. Well, I would say it's already been 50 years and there hasn't been any narrowing aside from the effects of 2 things, the economic rise of the South and movement of blacks out of the South. But another thing, there's another issue, is that I would say that the effects of segregation were not that bad. And that's sort of that, and that's something that's going to require a lot of evidence to go. And I wrote an article on that, and I sort of made a case for that. But that's something that a lot of people are not going to readily.
That the effects of segregation on black people aren't really that big of a deal, or they're overstated.
Yeah. That there's probably no effect. I think. Like school quality probably didn't matter. That's something, a lot of people look at that and they think that school quality probably mattered. The thing is though, like there was during World War I, 1917, this was back when they still had that, back when school segregation was still a big deal. Black schools got on average about half of what white schools got on a pupil basis. But in the Army IQ tests, because they were trying to fill out an army real quick, and they needed officers really fast, and they couldn't afford to have people rise up the ranks, so they basically gave you an IQ test. If you scored a certain way, you were an officer and stuff. So it's because they had to make it real quick. And the blacks scored about 83, if I recall correctly. So it was and so that was like deep in the heart of segregation. You could say, aha, so those 2 IQ points, those 2 IQ points, or 3 IQ points if you think the blacks are at 86 today. It's like, well, like, what do you think, whatever, if you think there was some narrowing from them, what do you think that was a result of? I mean, first of all, frankly, there's probably more white admixture in the black population since then. I mean, it's been 100 years. And also the narrowing of the IQ point since then. What sort of test was that even on? Was that on that was probably on the not very G-loaded test. That was probably on things like number recall, digit span, coding, things that are less heritable, less G-loaded, and also more malleable. Okay. And so a lot of people come in and say that, heritability is not the same as malleability. And technically that's not true, but in practice they kind of go together, because heritability doesn't necessarily mean malleability going forward, but it kind of means what has proven to be malleable so far. And so heritability and malleability, not technically the same thing, but they kind of go together in practice.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, I've got stuff to go look up.
Yeah. I'm not interested in like ambushing you or I'm gonna pwn you in the debate. Debates. So yeah, you can contact me whenever you want. I'll keystroke all this with you if you want. So and you can bring me back on, maybe even find some research thing that I haven't read and say, aha, Ryan, I bet you never thought of this. So
sure thing. All right. Well, thanks for the conversation, buddy.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. All right. What's up, buddy?
What a friendly race realist.